Good morning. Bright and early. Thank you all for being here and for being so prompt and arriving on time. We really appreciate it. We're really excited to welcome you back for day 2 of Washington Weekend. And we're starting off with a really fantastic presentation this morning featuring some of our Pulitzer Center journalist partners. And I'm really excited to have the chance to introduce all of them for our panel, How to Tell a Good Story and Get the Word Out. I think this is relevant to almost everyone's project in this room, so definitely be thinking of questions you want to ask. We're going to have a lot of time for Q&A once our panelists are done presenting up here. And yeah, so just to quickly introduce each of our featured speakers. First, over here, we have Peter Canellos, managing editor of Enterprise at POLITICO and author of the recent book, The Great Dissenter, the story of John Marshall Harlan, America's judicial hero. Next to Peter, we have Jaime Joyce. Jaime is a member of our Campus Consortium Advisory Council here at the Pulitzer Center and the former executive editor of Time for Kids. Next to Jaime, we have Ritu Chatterjee. Ritu is a health correspondent with NPR and has been a Pulitzer Center grantee. And finally, we have Julia Rendelman, a photojournalist and a journalism professor at one of our partner universities, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. So thank you again to each of our panelists for being here this morning. And Peter, I think I'm maybe handing it off to you first.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Libby, and it's great to see John and Kim Sawyer here, and it's amazing to see the real universe of talent that they've attracted and the powerful institution that they've built out of the Pulitzer Center, and to really revel in all of the outstanding work that you people have done. It was just a treat last night to be able to hear about just some of your projects, and I know that many of you are going to be presenting today too, and I'll try to hang around a little bit to see some of those as well. For people who are older journalists in the second half of their careers would like to put it, it's actually deeply energizing and exciting to see young people who are this excited about journalism and this eager also to get out in the world and see things and bear witness and cover activities. So in talking about storytelling, I wanted to address there are many things you could say about storytelling. Obviously, there are narrative techniques, there are reporting techniques that can really make a story pop. There are lots of rules of the road, obviously, that you're going to want to follow. But I wanted to talk about something a little bit unconventional and somewhat unpopular, actually, in this era, and that is fairness and objectivity as a way of making a more effective story. And I was attracted to that topic because I was at this same event last year, and we had a really good discussion, an interesting discussion at our table at, I think, exactly this time of the Washington weekend with young people about the pros and cons of mainstream journalism and traditional approaches to journalism. And some of the presenters at that event were very clearly motivated by deep-seated passions about some of the same issues that motivate all of the students here, that people who are really excited about getting out and giving voice to injustice, about the evils of and dangers of climate change and environmental destruction, about the need to redress race and gender wrongs, particularly in many places. But a lot of the presentations were aimed somewhat at the converted, which is very common in journalism today. You know, you're writing or presenting or putting together an audio or video presentation aimed at people who already agree with you and share most of your precepts. And the point that we were discussing at the table last year was the pros and cons of that approach. And we certainly have seen in recent years that ideologically driven journalism, websites that appeal to certain groups, narrow groups, larger groups, whatever, have done really well in journalism and have attracted large audiences. But the point that I wanted to make is that there is a higher purpose in journalism, and that is to take your readers to places where they don't always go, and to tell them things that they don't already believe, and to give them, evidence, information on which to act, which is, I think, the best definition of journalism when you get down to it. So I think that all of the people who are driven by those passions that I described would actually do a better job and be truer to the core spirit of journalism if they wrote a story that, in a very fulsome way, kind of encompasses the whole picture. Now, I hesitate to call out my own mentee from this year, Anusha Mather, who's going to present a little bit later today, but she's doing a piece about Panama, the coast of Panama, where there's been very, very rapid development, and it's had serious environmental and ecological concerns. But the truth may not be, I'm glad she's happy that I'm mentioning her here and not upset. But the bottom line is that when she went down there and did very diligent reporting, she found a very interesting, nuanced story, right? That it wasn't all destruction. A lot of the local people did appreciate the jobs that came with more rapid development. The influx of foreign capital, which felt to some people like an invasion, was actually something the Panamanian government was encouraging and proud of, that it promoted growth. On the other hand, there were also very, very serious environmental and ecological problems. And if you project outward from where she was, Playa Venaya, to talk about all of Central America and South America as a sort of gleaming Gold Coast sort of center of rapid development, there were going to be real problems. But she also found a solution in there. There's a group that is actually trying to do environmentally sustainable development in the same place. What I would say is that by addressing all of those concerns and painting that rounded picture, it means that people who read that story are going to be able to come away with a reasonable, trusted sense of what is going on the ground there, and they're going to understand more fully the full dimensions of the problem, and they're going to be able to take action. And if they are passionate about the need to redress ecological disaster on the one hand, but also the stripping of trees and other things that would exacerbate climate change, they're going to have a nuanced sense of how to do that from that story. And so I probably have talked already a little bit too long, but I would close my remarks by encouraging all of you to be rigorous in your reporting and not in any way to lose that passion. Your eyes and ears are your own best tools in journalism, and that sense of injustice that you may feel in pursuing these stories is absolutely in the truest spirit of journalism. But by telling a story that is nuanced, because the world is nuanced, actually increases the chances that people will take your work seriously and will get something useful out of it. And hey, you might even change some people's minds. So that's my contribution to storytelling. I know there are many other things that we can talk about a little later too.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jaime Joyce. It's great to be here this morning. Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Jaime Joyce. It's really wonderful to be here this morning and to talk to all of you. I haven't been back here since 2019. I think you guys all convened last year. The pandemic sort of threw us all off, so it's just a pleasure to be back. I am a freelance writer and editor, former executive editor of Time for Kids, which is Time Magazine's classroom news edition. I came to be associated with the Pulitzer Center in 2018 when I had the opportunity to do some reporting in Kenya about what life was like for kids at a refugee camp. So I wanted to do this story for Time, and Pulitzer Center allowed me to do that. And it was an incredible opportunity to be able to tell this story about kids to kids. Our core audience is between 8 and 12 years old, and we're really trying to build up this next generation of kids who consume the news and are critical thinkers. And so it's just an incredible opportunity to be able to do that. And since then, I've done several other stories at Time for Kids about children. It reported from Bangladesh about the Rohingya refugee crisis. Also from California, doing reporting on children of incarcerated parents. And also from Honduras in Tijuana, Mexico, writing about migration from Central America and why people were coming to this country and what was happening once they got to the border. When I was there, the Remain in Mexico policy was firmly in place. So there was a real, so many people there kind of stuck at that time. So I'm telling you all this, I'll back up a moment and give you a little bit more background about my professional life is that I am a former teacher. My first career was as an elementary school teacher. I taught for 7 years, and so I also taught in a friend's school, so it's really nice to be in this room. It's so much calmer than, last night's Flash and Dazzle, which was a wonderful room, but it's very nice to be in a friend's space with all of you. So I was a former teacher. I am a former teacher, and I have that comfort level around kids, so that to me, when you're reporting on kids, it really helps to have that experience. I'm curious from all of you reporting fellows, how many of you have interviewed children or teenagers for your work? Okay, so some of you, it can be hard, right? Right? It can be challenging. And it's particularly challenging when you are talking with children who've experienced trauma, who've gone through who are in the moment going through really difficult stuff. So I wanted to talk to you today about some real sort of basic things that I've learned and that I try to utilize in my reporting with children who are experiencing trauma, or just kids in general. I mean, I think in your career, there will be so many opportunities where you will talk to kids about really wonderful things and really tough things and everything in between. And so let me just start with, first of all, you want to talk to the adults in their lives. You want to, get their permission, get their buy-in. You want to be transparent about what you're doing. There's so much that goes on in this sort of pre-reporting stage. Learning as much as you can about the children that you'll be interviewing, and really thinking about the kinds of questions that you want to ask them. So that's really, really important. Get as much context as you can. It might be parents, grandparents, caregivers, teachers, social workers. They're all important sources. When I was in Bangladesh, reporting from the Rohingya refugee camps there in Cox's Bazar, I was able to spend some time visiting they call them child-friendly centers, and they're just sort of like community centers for the kids. And I just hung out there and observed and talked to the director there before I met with children, and was able to really get some great insight. She was able to show me some of the drawings that children had been doing when they arrived at the camp a year prior. And it was heartbreaking to see some of these kids, what they were depicting, what their memories of their villages being attacked. And so it was really, really, it helped me to understand, to get some real insight into what these kids had experienced. And then I'm able to see kind of, after I've seen these drawings, talk to the teacher, observe the kids, I'm able to then talk to the children in the room with a little bit more insight than I had before. So talking to those parents and those caregivers, those adults in the kids' lives is really important and will really help you. I have sort of talking points here, but they all kind of blur together, I think. Immerse yourself in the kids' environment. If you can, really spend as much time with them as you can. Hang back, observe, whether it's, wherever you are. When I was doing the reporting on children of incarcerated parents, I was working with a program called Get on the Bus, and part of that was getting on the bus with them. And so this was a program that took children to visit their parents in prisons throughout California. There were about 5 buses departing from various parts of the state. I took the bus with the shortest route, which was 5 hours. We started in Oakland, California at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I met the bus at this very dark church parking lot at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a little hard for me to get a taxi there because the Uber driver wanted to know why I needed to go to a church parking lot at 2 o'clock o'clock in the morning. And so that was an interesting experience. But getting there, waiting there, and seeing the children arrive with their grandparents was crucial for my story. I was able to, I'm waiting there, and I have 2 little girls running out of their SUV, hopping out of the car, running toward the bus in their pajamas, because they're going to go see their mom. And we spent 5 hours on that bus together. So I got to, see what that was like, talk to their grandmother, talk to other mothers and grandparents and aunts and uncles as we picked people up along that 5-hour trip. So that gave me some real insight into what these kids were experiencing. It wasn't that I just showed up at Folsom Prison one morning. It was actually on that journey with them, and that made a huge difference in my storytelling. Third piece out of 4 here. Make the child comfortable. Part of that will come from you just spending time in the room with them, just being this presence. If they're familiar with you, they've seen you, then they often are curious. And the kids who are curious may gravitate toward you, ask questions, but just your presence in that room, I think, is super helpful. I often, I would bring copies of Time for Kids with me when I was reporting, so kids knew, I would explain to them what I was doing, who I am, what kind of story I was working on, why I wanted to tell this story, and why I wanted to hear from them. And I think showing them the copy of the magazine, letting them flip through that, really helped develop this comfort level. Sometimes I would bring maps with me, and I would show them, okay, well, this is where I'm from, this is where we are, and we could kind of relate in that way a little bit. So it just developed this a little bit of familiarity in a tough situation. And also, going back to something that we heard last night about empathy, I think it's really important during that interview process to really show empathy when you're talking to kids. And, I remember sitting on the floor of a classroom in Bangladesh, and that's another thing, get down on their level, sit on the floor with little kids, I think that it really helps you. But I remember talking to this little girl who's telling me about what it was like to flee her village and what it was like for her family. And so developing that empathy, talking to them and saying wow, that must have been really tough. What was that like? That must have been hard. Wow, you're really brave. Just sort of acknowledging the difficulties that they're experiencing, I think, is important just on a human level that we do this. We're journalists, but we're humans too, and people, and not just kids, they're telling us about really difficult moments in their lives. And lastly, I think this applies to children certainly, and it applies to anybody who's gone through trauma, but you want to end that interview by leaving that kid in a good place and kind of taking them out of that difficulty, all that tough stuff they were just telling you. When I was in Tijuana visiting a school that was set up for migrant kids, I was talking to a 6-year-old girl, and she was telling me about, what it was like staying. The school was attached to a shelter, so I had toured the shelter, toured the school, and she was telling me about what she. I was like, well, what are you looking forward to she told me she had family in the U.S. I said, well, what are you looking forward to when you get there? And she told me that she was really excited to eat ice cream, and she was really excited to play with her cousins, and she was smiling by the end of this interview. So I think, to be able to end that interview after you've talked about some tough stuff, to leave the kid in a place where they feel good and they're smiling and they can, hopefully, I think that's the best we can hope for. So all of those things really will help you in your storytelling, and they've helped me, and so I wish you all the best of luck in whatever you do next, and I really look forward to learning more about your projects as the day goes on. Thank you.
at an age where I need progressives, but I haven't gotten around to getting them yet. Hello, everyone. That was a tough act to follow. Thank you, both Peter and Jamie, for that great presentation, and thank you all for being here. It's a real honor to be here. My association with the Pulitzer Center started as a grantee. This was back in 2013. I was wrapping up a job here in DC, and I was about to move back to my home country, India, which is where I'm from. And I think I was moving back in November, and in July, this horrific news of this horrific incident at a school in a rural a rural part of India, in this one of the poorest states, Bihar, reached here, where kids who went to school regular day ate their school meal, school lunch. So India has the world's largest school lunch program. And 23 of them died. And many more were hospitalized. It was horrifying. And it turned out that the food, which was being cooked in like the principal's home or somewhere in the school building, had become laced with pesticides. Anyway, so that was, and I still remember, I think, Kem actually reaching out to me saying, hey, is this something you're interested in? This is just horrifying. And I was like, yeah, this is horrifying. And people were starting to question whether this massive school lunch program, the world's largest, was failing. And within India, people were calling to end the program. Some were talking about taking it away from like being run by the government and turning it over to like a private company. There was a lot of understandable outrage. So I moved back to India and I started digging into it. And obviously this was a major failure, and there were many states that were failing, going back to the point Peter made about really looking at like going deep, really trying to understand beyond sort of what sort of rises to the surface, which at the time was, this program seems like a total failure. How could pesticides become laced with food being fed to the children? But when I got on the ground, I started discovering a more nuanced story, and what rose to the surface. And I'll pause a little bit here to tell you a little bit about my background. I came to I was a scientist before I became a journalist, and so I often will start out really digging deep to look at what data is out there, you know, and I try to ground my pieces and start my pieces with data, and preferably peer-reviewed, published data. If not, like whatever government data is out there, I really try to, and when it isn't there, I try to get a very good sense of what information, what data isn't there, and that's kind of becomes the starting point for my stories. And some of the benefits, especially in the states that had done a good job in running the school lunch program, I was finding lots of social benefits, but one little piece of data gathered by economists that rose to the surface for me is this program had employed nearly 2 million of India's most marginalized women. And I'm talking about women belonging to lower castes who have a poor chance at getting an education, poor chance having an employment, victims of domestic abuse, violence from their own communities, all kinds of other discrimination, acts of discrimination. And so I wanted to play to you the story. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is something that I've never heard before. And I started to look in. So, well, what does it mean for 2 million of India's most marginalized women to get, and the pay, by the way, was peanuts. The pay wasn't much, but steady source of employment, which especially in poorer rural areas, gets women out of their homes, and it's some money that they make themselves. Coming from a place where most of them were probably married off early. And so I started looking around, so who is going to help me tell this story? You know, I need to ground the story in a place and a person, right? Which is, I think, one of those rules of good storytelling. So I started calling around, and somebody told me, well, you know, there's a union of school kitchen workers, and there's a woman who's a leader in one of India's most patriarchal states, and you should talk to her. And I called her up, and I was like, hey, you know, could you put me in touch with a woman? And then she started telling her story, and I was like, you're my character. And luckily, she was willing to, and the reason I said that was because once she started telling me the fact that she had been married off at 15, and she had lived through almost 20 years of domestic violence. And in this case, I was lucky I lived about a couple hours away from her, so I could do multiple visits. Because going in, I also knew that for talking to victim of domestic violence, even though she's currently out of that state, it's going to be tough, it's going to be heavy. You know, Jamie talked about some of the rules of talking to children who are traumatized. A lot of those rules actually apply for talking to adults who've been through something traumatic as well. And for any of you who are covering trauma-related topics, a good resource is the DART Center for Trauma and Journalism. They have very good guidelines about sort of good best practices to follow when talking to somebody who's, you know, questions to ask, questions not to ask. And in this case, I had the comfort of language. She spoke my language, I spoke hers. I had the comfort of visiting her multiple times. And I had the comfort, and because I could visit with her multiple times, I could actually hang out with her and get a sense of place. So I want to play a little bit of the story. I won't play the whole 7-minute piece, just to get the discussion going as well. So, and you'll notice one of the things that we use more so in radio, but I think it applies to print storytelling as well and visuals too, is to think about getting at the chronology. Like we use, radio is a very linear form. I don't know if, is there anybody here interested in audio storytelling? Great. And so, you know, the frustrating part of radio is sometimes we can't get at all the like nuance, but it's a very linear form. And very concise, precise writing. So as you'll see, I started off with the data, but we don't even start the storytelling with any data. It's very grounded in this one woman's story. I want to play a little bit of it just to give you a sense of the character, the place, tension, which I was very fortunate to get in my first trip with her, first visit with her. So here we go.
This is Morning Edition from NPR News. Good morning, I'm David Green.
And I'm Renee Montaigne. This next story is about a woman who lived with domestic violence for 20 years. Not anymore. What changed her life was going to school, not to learn, but to cook. Reporter Ritu Chatterjee has the story from Northern India.
Namaste. Saroj is on her way to work. That's actually her full name. Many people here in the state of Haryana don't have last names. Saroj is a cook in a nearby school. She's short, hardly 5'2", but she walks tall down narrow streets of concrete houses with cows and buffaloes outside. We walk past an old man sitting outside a house, and she leans in close to me and whispers,
"That man sitting on that chair, he's my brother-in-law, my husband's elder brother. He quarreled a lot with me."
I ask her, what did he quarrel about?
Well, to control me, so that I didn't come and go as I please. He wanted me to ask for his permission. That's why.
Saroj spent most of her life confined to her home, obeying the men in her family. Today, she lives life on her own terms. That's unusual for women in rural India. And it took Saroj more than 2 decades to break free from the traditional rules of the region. Her parents married her off at 16.
शादी होके यहाँ पे आई
I came here after I got married.
Her husband was from this village, Dujana, in the northern state of Haryana. The marriage gave her 2 daughters and 2 6-inch scars on the inside of her left arm.
ये लकड़ी से मारा था मेरे को
This, he hit me with a piece of wood, my husband.
Saroj tried to get help by telling relatives.
किसी से बात करते तो ये कहते
If I told someone, they'd say, after all, it's your husband beating you, not some random man.
This is a particularly patriarchal and violent part of India. Domestic violence is common. 10 years went by like this. Then, one day, Saroj's husband just disappeared. Months later, she had no idea whether he was alive or dead. Eventually, Saroj was treated like a widow. And widows here in Haryana are often married off to one of their husband's younger brothers. So Saroj moved in with her younger brother-in-law, a man named Dharamveer.
ये सोचा था मन कि चलो भी ये है
I thought, well, he'll raise my children. He'll look after me.
What happened was the opposite. He drank a lot and was more violent than his brother. She stayed with him, even bore him a son, but she felt miserable and helpless. When her son was still a toddler, she finally met the first person who was sympathetic to her. Santra Devi is a local school teacher.
ये दिन की लड़की का दाखला करवाने आई थी
She had come to get her daughters admitted at the school. We started talking, and I came to know that poor thing.
So, do you get a sense of kind of how I use the chronology as the main sort of narrative tool? And obviously what's gone into this is I also talked to her relatives, I've talked to people she's worked with, because tricky thing with like victims of trauma is also like with any personal story you also have to sort of fact check their story, right? You're respectful to their story, but also there's a lot that goes into gathering kind of the reporting process. And obviously through that I found this teacher who then became another narrative tool. Like she's met this teacher who sort of takes on. So you're starting to get a sense of what happens when a woman leaves the house. And she meets this woman. And she meets this woman.
Can you turn the audio off on that?
Yes.
Creating some buzz. There you go. That's perfect.
So she'd met this woman, this teacher, just as this school and the district and the state was starting to implement the school lunch program. So they needed somebody to work in the school kitchen to make the meals. And that was kind of the beginning of her journey out of kind of, decades of domestic violence. And then like through the story, I sort of follow that and end it where she's now a union leader. And there are women who haven't even gone to school who are joining the union and getting new jobs now. And she's like, I'm going to make you the leader of your block. You don't have to worry about anything. Like, we're not lagging behind men anymore. I'm going to teach you. So it was really sort of mapping her. Through her, I'm telling the story of like the 2 million women who have been empowered by this. And one thing that I will mention about sort of anybody doing any work where you're talking to victims or survivors of trauma, Jamie mentioned that when you're wrapping up interviews with kids, you bring them back to a place of now, so you're not leaving them still thinking about something traumatic that they went through. And I think that's true of when you go into a story. I was moderating a panel with a psychologist about covering climate crises and the emotional toll on communities and reporters. And one of the things she said really stuck with me. When you go looking for trauma, you sort of flatten people. So I'm the one thing, if you end up doing something about trauma, also it's part of it, yes, you end the interview at a place where you bring them back to today, but also try to get a sense of like their agency. How have they struggled to cope? How have they, something that they went through, how did they try and get out of that? Because nobody's just the trauma that they've experienced, right? There's often resilience and skills that come out of that. So be mindful of that too. And I've now ended my 10 minutes and I look forward to the questions.
Good morning. It's great to be here with you guys. The last time I was here was 9 years ago, and I was pregnant, so I'm having a much better time this time. So I'm a freelance photojournalist and a professor of journalism at Southern Illinois University. And 12 years ago, I was sitting where you are. I was a reporting fellow. My background is in daily newspapers, and I got into journalism for all the wrong reasons. Basically, I'm nosy, and I'm interested in a lot of things intensely for a short time. So I'm going to give you some brief advice today on getting the word out through my own experience as a full-time freelancer. Maybe the environment is a little different for writers than it is for visual journalists, but hopefully there's some stuff here that you can take home. Okay, so I've organized these things into 4 thoughts: relationships, location, pitching, and stories. I'll be brief. Relationships. I think this is the most important part of freelancing. In the beginning, you're not going to know any editors, or maybe you just know a few, and you want to get to the place where you're the go-to for editors, right? They're looking for someone who can solve a problem for them and has a good attitude. Be easy to work with. Enjoy saying yes. My first year of freelancing, I call the year of yes. I turned down no assignments. You guys, I took pictures of toilet parts for a plumbing magazine. And I've seen your work, so you guys can probably skip this ring of the, career ladder. You guys are doing great. Okay, so the year of yes. Be flexible while you're working on your relationships. Cold emails are okay. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Keep in touch with the editors who hire you. Let them know what you're working on. Be nice. If you can't take an assignment, maybe you can recommend someone who can. That can go a long way. Some more ideas for building these relationships: go to conferences and portfolio reviews. I'm a fan of the Leave Behind. Here's mine. It's just a postcard with a picture that I took, my name, and how to get in touch with me. So maybe the editor will take that back to their office and put it on their bulletin board, and then when they're like, man, I need a photographer in such and such a town, they'll look and see your postcard and give you a call. At the portfolio review, be open and receptive to critical feedback. Even if your portfolio isn't up to your standards, it will go further with your editor if you're open to the feedback instead of excuses why you couldn't make the better picture. Okay, location. Last night I was explaining how I had moved from Richmond, Virginia to Carbondale, Illinois, which is kind of the middle of nowhere, and someone said, well, it's not like Richmond was the center of the universe. But actually, that's kind of the point here. Maybe you don't need to go to the center of the universe when you're starting. Maybe there's plenty of freelancers in New York City. Maybe not. This is just from my experience. So right after I moved to Richmond, I had taken a buyout from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and moved markets to Richmond, Virginia. And almost right away, a picture of our governor, a Democrat, resurfaced from his law school yearbook, and it featured 2 men, one wearing Klan robes and the other wearing blackface. And the governor apologized, took credit for being in the photo for 24 hours, and then he remembered it couldn't be him in the picture. He remembers every time he wore blackface. Yeah, that happened. And so this time it wasn't him. So as you might have guessed, this was a big story. And I was hired every day for 30 days. So if you haven't relied on freelance income, you may not hear what I'm saying. $300 to $800 a day for 30 days really takes the pressure off. So I guess my point here is positioning myself in a market that wasn't oversaturated with talented photographers, but still had a significant amount of national news, helped me in my career and got me steady work. Okay, let's see. Number 3, pitching. Okay, pitching, not hitting. You will pitch and pitch and pitch. And if you're lucky and you've fostered some of those meaningful relationships with editors, you might get an email back. But sometimes you'll feel like you're pitching into the ether. Don't stop pitching. But sometimes, okay, a little from my own experience here. When I moved to Southern Illinois, it was right about the time Roe was overturned, and I knew that abortion access was going to be a big story. This little town, Carbondale, where I'm from, is about an hour from Kentucky, and we have now 2 abortion clinics where we had none before. And I was looking for a way to tell this story, and I found Elevated Access is this group of pilots who donates their time, airplane, everything, to fly women from states without access to states with access. It's Illinois-based. So I took a leap of faith. I had access to a female pilot. I drove to East Tennessee on my own dime, and I spent a weekend with her. I put together a little pitch. I sent it around. An editor I often work with at the New York Times liked it, and she took it to committee, like a pitch meeting, and they hated it. And they said that that pilot story was not enough to stand alone. And that was discouraging because I was out money and time and I really believed in the story. But 2 months later, she emailed me back and she said, you know what, Julia, we're doing a bigger story at the 1-year anniversary of the overturning of Roe. And we'd like to incorporate elevated access, and we want to send you back out on assignment to work on this. And I think it was a 3-day assignment. So what I'm saying here is sometimes your pitch isn't perfect, but don't be discouraged. Sometimes things like that can happen. I want to talk just for a minute about the cold email. We can talk about this more later. This is how I normally do it. I keep it brief, and I'm clear in my email subject, abortion access photo pitch. Okay, I start with my name, where I'm located, a sentence, 2 if I'm feeling wordy about the story, and then a low-res PDF of maybe a dozen images. Obviously, my website contact information is there. If I don't get an answer in like a day or 2, usually maybe 2 or 3, I'll say, hey, I'm just going to move on in the pitching process. Thanks for looking at my email. And I find that often this is when, if there's interest, they'll be like, oh, wait, don't go on. Maybe we can do something here. Let's start a conversation. Okay, there's a lot more I could say about pitching. And maybe you guys want to talk. So here, you can pick up my leave behind, and all my contact information is on here. And I'd love to share with you everything I know. Death to gatekeeping in this industry, right? We are all here to hold the door open for you. Okay. My last point is about your story. Make it unique, obviously. One little anecdote about how I was able to do that once as a freelancer. So in 2017 in Richmond, the signs of the opioid epidemic were really apparent all around. But that story was sort of tired in the eyes of editors. You know, they wanted like a unique angle. How do we keep telling the story and getting viewers interested? And about this time, actually a Republican sheriff in the county next to where I was living started, I think the first ever, in jail Narcotics Anonymous style rehabilitation pod. And I was like, this is so cool, right? He told me, I'm sick of locking up the same people for the same petty crimes when addiction is the central issue. So as a freelancer, I was really nervous about getting access to this story, but I really wanted it. So I just sent him the cold email. And the sheriff called me down to the jail. And he looked at my portfolio, he ran a background check on me, and he gave me access. Let's see. Within a few weeks, I had that carte blanche access to jail. The guards would buzz me in with my camera into the cell block anytime I wanted. It was really special. The Pulitzer Center actually granted me and made that story possible. And we were able to publish with ABC, the Marshall Project, Richmond Magazine, and a few others. What I'm saying here is if you have an idea and it's important to you, don't give up. Be flexible, be open to feedback, and be willing to adapt the story slightly if it helps you get it published. Okay, thank you so much.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. Thanks so much, Julia, Ritu, Jamie, Peter. There are many questions whirling around in my head right now, and hopefully everyone in our audience is thinking of questions as well. I thought I would give you all time to think for a second, and I could start off with a first question. I feel like this was touched on through a few different of your presentations, but I know in my handful of years working with the reporting fellows that a lot of times our students have an idea, they have their idea in mind of this is what my good story is going to be. They arrive in the field and you're led in a completely different direction. You dig deep, you see the full picture that Peter mentioned, and it's like, where do I go next? So I was wondering if any of you or each of you, however many of you want to answer this, could speak a little bit to navigating those pivots. How do you know which thread to follow to get you to that, good story? And y'all can use that microphone there.
I'll start with a recent experience, without giving away too much of the story because it hasn't aired yet. So I was in Bogota, Colombia recently to profile this sort of groundbreaking program that was trying to support unpaid family caregivers. And one of their big goals is, so just to, again, going back to just putting into context with data, 75% of caregiving inside the house, that's taking care of children, cooking, cleaning, taking care of the elderly, falls on the shoulders of women and girls. 75% of all this unpaid caregiving work is done by women and girls around the world. So it's a very gendered division of labor, which is even starker in Colombia, and it often keeps women out of the workforce. There's documented sort of mental health strains from sort of doing this work for a long time, keeps women mired in poverty because they can't go out and work. So the program was trying to support unpaid caregivers, primarily women, and reconnect them to the workforce. And I was like, that's cool. That's awesome. Getting women out of the house, giving them an education, getting them to work. And I had some stats from the city government. They had, so many women had graduated high school, so many women had made contacts and had entrepreneurship classes. And I get there and I'm like, all the women are like, yeah, we want to work, but who's going to do the caregiving if I leave and work? Like, you can give me a class or two every now and then. You can provide some childcare support. I can drop off my kid for an hour or two at these care blocks. Some women had gotten work, but the vast majority, the program in its third or fourth year of existence was not happening. Women aren't getting back to the workforce, primarily because who's going to do the work at home if they leave? And that the job market was still actively discriminating against women. For caregivers to go to work, they wanted flexibility, they wanted part-time jobs, and employers weren't budging with how they are used to doing things. So I was like, okay, what is the story then? I came here all the way to Bogota. NPR sent me here. But what I realized on the ground that there were much more these profound yet intangible cultural changes that the program was bringing about. Whereas Big Goal was struggling, but it was also revealing of bigger issues in society that this program alone can't tackle. And that actually became part of the story. So sometimes you go in, you can look at these numbers from governments telling you, and you might go there and, to actually keep looking at why isn't this succeeding, can actually become part of the story and very telling about, and I do a lot of solution stories. So for me, hitting those points where kind of the goals aren't working can be very unpacking them can be very telling about anybody who's interested in addressing these sort of big social issues.
I'll just add that, you know, sometimes when I've said this to reporting fellows in the past in sort of these welcome meetings where we talk about sort of big ideas and takeaways, and that is to always, you know, have this ongoing list, this running list of ideas for stories. And I have found that I may be reporting on a particular story, and when I'm there, some other idea comes up, but I know that's not my story, and I'm not going to change directions, but I make a note to come back to that another time. Maybe it's a year later, maybe it's 2 years later, maybe it's 5 years that I've heard about some place, but that story sticks with me. So I just want to encourage you to keep that running list of stories, and you never know when you will need it and when that time will come for you to tell that story.
I'll add one piece on that, and that is that this is one area where it's more helpful to be on staff than to be a freelancer, because if you're on staff, you do have the flexibility to shift gears, or sometimes even to tell your editors, look, this story isn't working out quite that way, or we need another week or two on it a little bit. And it's much more pressure if you are a freelancer who's pitched a certain idea and then the idea turns out to be something different. It's just a very difficult world, and I was very impressed by Julia's presentation, and it's total credit to you that you've built such a thriving career in this. And now that I'm thinking about it, I think I do know the waterway story you're talking about, of course, from Carbondale, Illinois, that area. But it's a hard go. I mean, it's a very, very hard go, and it's bruising sometimes, because you are in that position of having to go to editors. Sometimes you don't know them, pitch a story, then you have to come back to them and say it's not quite what it is, so as you plan your careers and think about your careers, this is something that it's an easier go if you are a staffer than if you're a freelancer. It's very hard to be a freelancer, and if you want to take advantage of the flexibility of being a freelancer, do it later in your career, I would say.
All right, any questions from our audience members?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah, and I just graduated from Northwestern University in Qatar. Am I audible?
I'm asking you to stand up.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
We're changing the format today. Everyone has to stand up.
My bad. Okay. I just want to thank you all for taking out the time. My question is for Ritu or anybody who has worked with data. I noticed that you said that you consult government data sources and official data sources. Do you ever find yourself questioning the government data, and are you ever skeptical? So are you ever consulting alternative data?
Yeah, I'm always multiple sources, right? Like you want to corroborate, double check, especially official sources. So like I said, with this Bogota story, I had like these impressive looking numbers. And some of the things that they said were, panned out, but you always want to verify. Yeah.
Congratulations on graduating.
Yes, congratulations.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christian Thomas, and I'm a junior at Hampton University. Going around interviewing people, I've always had questions on how established journalists go about interviewing people on the spot. So could you kind of speak to if you're reaching out to somebody and they don't kind of respond to it, but you see them in person, how do you kind of go about interviewing them without kind of making it a little just right up in their face kind of thing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, you're asking you don't want to be like, hey man, you didn't get back to me on that email. I think just being human is how I always start, just with conversation, being conversational, how was your weekend? Or, I don't think I would point out the fact that they dissed you and just start with that normal conversation, and then you could swing back to, I actually had some questions on this thing, and do you have a few minutes we could maybe talk about it? That's how I would do it. Oh yeah, of course.
Hi everybody, my name is Layla. I'm currently a senior at Hunter College. And my question is, how do you protect the privacy of your interviewees, I feel like we all know about like Vice and how they like basically sometimes just release the location of these people and then they end up getting hurt because they're covering topics that may be, you know, controversial. And then also, when do you feel like this is like the line of which I'm not going to include in my piece, where it's too personal to the person, where I'm not exploiting trauma for clicks? So.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if this will completely answer your question, but I'm thinking about, you know, when I was reporting on kids whose parents were incarcerated, one of the organizations that I was working with, you know, I had talked to them in advance, explained the story that I wanted to do, and made it very clear that I wanted to feature children. And so you have to certainly, you know, showing the photos of children is, you know, very sensitive. And so I had to have the buy-in of this organization first. And so that can be very helpful to you if you have that. That's great. And also within that organization, the parents, you know, or the caregivers were given consent. And if they did not want to be photographed or they didn't want to be interviewed, they wanted no media access, you know, they had a little tag on their name tag that said like, no photos, no interviews. So, you know, some organizations are, if you're working with somebody, if you have a source, they're really helpful in that way. But I think you're asking a very different question. But I think I just add that because when you sort of build these relationships and explain clearly what you're doing, especially when you're working with kids, you know, there are ways that you can be really sensitive from the get-go, and that's, to me, is an ideal situation.
Yeah, I would add something that's a little bit contradictory. One is that in this moment in journalism, actually using people's real names and having them cooperate with stories is very, very important. Just because everybody doubts the news, right? Fake news, whatever, it adds a lot of credibility to have a real person with a real name speaking their own truth in the story. The one part that's contradictory too is that I think that sometimes if you're reporting in situations where you're dealing with vulnerable people, it is a little bit on you to be protective of them. And even if they're willing to use their names, if it's a situation where you think they're going to be brutally harassed online or that they're acknowledging something that could turn the authorities against them if you're reporting overseas, for example, or otherwise cause them tremendous harm and embarrassment, but that they seem like not to see this coming, I would trust your own judgment. I mean, I think at the end of the day, you know, journalists are sort of responsible for the outcomes of their stories in some rough justice sense, not strictly, not unexpected things that happen in stories and all that. But so I would approach it with the idea that there's tremendous value and credibility in getting people to use their real names and speak their honest truth and tell their stories directly to you, but that you also have to protect them if they go in a direction that could be very harmful to them.
So I'll add, thank you for mentioning that last point, Peter, because I'll give you an example. So I did a story about sort of the most evidence-based form of prevention of school violence. It was a profile of a young man who at one point went on Facebook. He was still in high school, and he was about 25 when I interviewed him, said, "This school deserves a school shooting or something." And the whole story was about how that freaked everybody out and what the school's threat assessment team did to kind of look into the case and figure out whether it was a valid threat or not. It wasn't. And this child had tremendous amount of trauma in his past. He'd been like the victim of violent attacks at school, and had like physical injuries, had lost sight. And clearly he had come off of that path and was doing fine, was working as in like the security business. And he was like, yeah, fine, use my name, full name, I don't care. If an employer, I was like, are you sure? He said, yeah, because if an employer doesn't want to hire me, I'm putting the story out, I don't want to work with them. But we really, and I was very fortunate to have editors all the way up the chain of command at NPR really sensitive to this, and we decided to use his nickname and not his full name. And this happens a lot. I cover mental health now, where, at a time when more and more people are open to speaking up there and sharing their personal stories, but there is still tremendous stigma. And I'm often talking about mental health issues faced by children and adolescents. And so we often, if a parent is open to sharing the child's name, it's fine. But often what happens is they are hesitant, so we end up using the middle name. So I do tend to err on the side of caution, because I am talking often to people in vulnerable states of life. We don't do anonymous. We don't use pseudonyms. We tend to go with their middle names, that seems to work.
I like that point that you made earlier, Jamie, as well, in terms of bringing the physical magazine or the physical publication and showing it to the kids. And I've heard that as well from Ben Taub, who's another Pulitzer Center grantee who writes for The New Yorker, and I think is often interviewing adults, but he's doing the same thing. He's traveling around the world, bringing that magazine and saying, if you agree to speak with me, if you agree to work with me for this story, this is where your words will end up. And just making sure, that your sources understand that they know, where their story is going to appear.
Can I add one more thing? I also will, especially when I'm, interviewing vulnerable people or just ordinary people who don't know what it's like to talk to the media, and they're sharing like very vulnerable details about themselves, right? I generally, at the start of the interview, I do a lot of explaining of my process. Because most people who don't talk to reporters don't know what they're signing up for. Like, I don't know why people do that again and again, giving us a lot of details about their lives. They don't know that they're signing up for that. So I often tell them the process, and oftentimes I end up talking to a lot of people, and maybe some of them won't make it into the story. And so that upfront, it's part of the trust building. It's part of making sure that they understand where you're coming from, what the final product might be. Like Jamie, I might play them something, if I'm there in person, I might play them something, one of my stories before, previous stories or whatever. But and I also tell them, especially if people are about to share trauma, that if there's something that I'm asking that they're not comfortable answering, again, being very careful, as Jamie mentioned, not to re-traumatize them. I'm like, if we start to go somewhere where you're not comfortable, just let me know. And we can take breaks. So that helps with it as well.
I just was going to add that, there's a real difference between talking to someone in politics or a public figure. They're used to talking to the media. Many of the people that you will interview, that we interview, they're regular people. They're not experienced with the media, so it's so important to explain your process. I've often I think it's important to explain also, like, we're going to talk for a long time, and I'm going to use just a little bit because people are often surprised that you haven't created a transcript to tell your story. So I think that's also important too and can be helpful.
I wanted to add something after Ritu's point that I often work for an international newspaper based in Finland, and I think sometimes it seems easier for people. So when we're interviewing them, obviously it's in English, we're in America, but they'll say, oh yeah, well, you can go ahead and print that, it doesn't matter, it'll be in Finnish anyway. And then I have to remind them, that the internet is forever, and Google Translate is real, and so I don't want them to feel comfortable in that, maybe no one will see it because it's in a foreign language. I make sure to let them know that it's possible that anyone could see it.
Other questions? I don't have a clear path back there, but maybe could we pass this to Hannah? Chain of hands.
Ooh, yeah, this is a question for Peter and what you were saying about sort of objectivity. I was wondering if you think there are certain specific stories where those rules, it's not that they don't apply, but that they're different. For instance, if you are writing like a long, say you're just writing a long profile about somebody who is an activist against like water pollution, and their water is polluted, and like with those kinds of stories, I sometimes feel like quote unquote balance would mean reaching out to the pipeline company that polluted their water and saying, hey, did you pollute this person's water? And the pipeline company says, we have no idea what you're talking about. And then you sort of have to, I mean, I think it is due diligence sometimes just to print that. Like, obviously, as a matter of principle, like I typically reach out to industry representatives because I consider it a matter of principle, and sometimes their answers might surprise me, maybe. But I was wondering if there are sometimes stories where finding the definition of objectivity gets really slippery.
Well, I think that one of the things you're referring to is the different genres of journalism. So if you have made a decision that you're going to be doing a profile of a prominent environmental activist, you presumably have already done the work to see that this person is pretty legitimate in what they're doing and things like that. So focusing on them and their work and what's interesting about their work is totally justified. But I would say that you could actually get in trouble if in the course of writing about that you talk about some terrible polluted river that in fact is not polluted, or that the person has grossly distorted in some way what the complete story is. And not only would that sort of set you up for a lot of criticism, but if you were a freelancer writing for an organization or something, they would be very upset if that were the case. So some of it is just legitimate fact-checking, as you were suggesting. But I also think that a nuanced story is a more interesting story. I mean, if this person is fighting in a disputed context about whether this river is really polluted or not, it makes the story more interesting, right? And you can get deeper into what's really going on in that situation. One other thing I'd mention on the objectivity front too is that point came back to me during Nick Schifrin's talk last night. A lot of us in the last few days have seen people going online to various chat groups. I mean, I've heard from a lot of different activist groups and things like that, people online who will say Hamas's onslaught against Israel, it's totally Israel's fault, far-right cabinet, long history of oppression of Palestinians, deal with Saudi Arabia, it was destabilizing, whatever, the situation. And yet, if someone like Nick goes and actually shows pictures and tells stories of average citizens who have been killed, it's very hard to sort of sustain those arguments. It penetrates the echo chamber in a really powerful way. Now, today we have retaliation going on, Israel in Gaza, and it's very easy that on the other side, people are, this is Israel's right to defend itself. My God, even Joe Biden says it's okay. I mean, what do you expect them to do? They were provoked in this horrible way. But if he is going into Gaza and is going to show how these innocent civilians that had nothing to do with Hamas are having their lives totally destroyed and their community totally devastated and all that, it cuts through the echo chamber. It makes people understand the full picture of what's going on in the world. And I think it does take people off of their ideological pedestal. So that's another strong justification for objective journalism. We need things. I'm the head of the Alumni Association at Penn, my university. We recently had a Palestinian writers' conference before the Hamas onslaught. There was a Palestinian writers' conference there. And I heard from so many people on both sides who really knew nothing and admitted that they knew nothing about who these writers were. It's just the simple fact that they were Palestinian set off all kinds of, backs and forths and things. And my point to the student journalists at our college newspaper was, well, this is the purpose of mainstream journalism. If the people participating in this conference are indeed supporters of terrorism, let's do that research. Let's call them out. Let's raise that question seriously. If, on the other hand, it's something far, far, far more attenuated, like they attended some meeting 10 years ago where something was discussed that may have, supported some, questionable policy, then write it and clear the air. And by doing that, you ratchet down tensions on both sides. You cause less pain in the community. You bring people closer to a solution and a resolution. So that would be.
So sticking to the environmental thread of your initial question, I'll give an example. This is early on in my career. I was working with a couple of reporters at the Center for Public Integrity, looking at this mysterious kind of chronic kidney disease that was cropping up in different far away parts of the world, and we were looking at Sri Lanka. And normally, chronic kidney disease, if you normally get it if you have long-term hypertension or diabetes. But in these places, it was first found in Central America, and I was looking, it had cropped up in Sri Lanka, all the way on the other side of the world. And the WHO and the Sri Lankan government had been looking into it, and the population that was being affected was like healthy, working age, primarily males, rice farmers. This was a rice farming community. And so the WHO came out with this finding that it was farm chemicals, so pesticides and fertilizers that were causing this. And this goes back to your question about data as well. We had the data, but talking to physicians on the ground, talking to scientists all the way on the other side of the world, we realized that it was unlikely to be as simple as that. And also the fact that the data that the WHO and the Sri Lankan government released was very poor, like it was just kind of, they didn't quite substantiate where they got that connection from. Connecting a disease epidemic to farm chemicals needs a lot of, you need a lot of proof to be able to really hold that up together. So we did report that it's like the headline was it was linked to farm chemicals, but the story really went into the fact that that's not quite substantiated. And the picture is likely to be more complex than that. And that's a better story. Right? And that's because now we know that this disease is cropping up in other places, and there's a connection to climate change and heat. So you do have to do the due diligence of really digging into claims, even when it's coming from credible sources like the WHO.
I'll add a quick story about specifically what you're asking about. I mentioned that I used to work in Pittsburgh, so we had a lot of these stories, particularly around fracking. And at that time, the chemicals in fracking, there was a proprietary list, so we didn't know what was in the fracking chemicals. But there was a neighborhood about 45 minutes north of Pittsburgh where right after fracking, everybody's well water, groundwater, started to make them sick. And you maybe have seen the pictures of the water catching on fire out of the faucet. But because of all the legacy issues of industry in Pittsburgh, it was you couldn't just connect it like A plus B is C, So we actually were able to work with a professor at Duquesne University who was doing like independent research and testing the waters for chemicals, and that really strengthened the reporting, I think.
Hi, I'm John Bateman, just graduated from School of the Art Institute of Chicago with an MFA in writing. This has been really fantastic, and I have a practical question for each of you, because we're talking about stories that aren't just done in a day or a week. How do you suggest, especially for freelancing, organizing how we track? We've got an open records request on this one story. We're trying to get policymakers to respond on another. And in keeping our own stories and work on track so we can get them submitted to the editors and not lose a story and not get something out that's important.
So just to learn a little bit more about your question, you're saying how do you keep the story on track when you're doing a very long-term story? Is that the idea and stuff? With multiple stories, and you're multitasking in different ways. I mean, my observation on that is that some people are good at it and some people are not good at it. And the ones who are not are not good at the multitasking have to adjust their work habits to play to their strengths. And especially if you're freelancing, you're kind of like your own boss, and people who are newsroom leaders confront this all the time. There is the person who is like terrific at the story that you have a month for them to do, but could not turn something around quickly if you put a gun to their head. And then there are the people who will immediately spot something and get it out the door. But if you ask them to go a little bit deeper, they'll have a lot of trouble in that. So, editors naturally kind of steer people towards stories that play to their strength. But when you're a freelancer, you should do the same and sort of be your own editor in that process. In terms of multitasking and following these different stories, I personally don't think it's such a terrible, daunting thing. I think that if you keep your mind that at every moment you want to be productive and you want to be working on the thing that is most immediate at that moment and is likely to have the most payoff at that moment, you can rearrange your schedule. You can put some things on the back burner and jump on something else. I mean, it's not an unusual situation for somebody to be working on a long-term kind of investigative type story that has lots of twists and turns, but then have more immediate stories pop up and, shift gears to be able to knock those out.
I guess again, I think I'm in the not so good category, but I think, and I'm trying to get better about it, and thankfully I have an editor who, I have a story list going, and normally for each story I'll just have like a, Google Docs folder, and I've become better because my editors remind, put it down in the Google Doc, like you're working on this. And then like periodically just going and kind of rearranging like what's going, okay, the news might be moving faster on this front, so this one moves to the top and the other one moves to the bottom. And that kind of visually, it actually helps me. It helps me be better on the organizing and tracking and everything. But it takes practice, and it helps when somebody else is. If you're not inclined to do that, it helps to have external pressures pushing you to do it. Either one of you.
Well, thank you again so much to our panelists. Thank you for all of your questions. Yeah, let's give them. I also forgot to shout out in my introductions that each of our panelists have also advised at least one reporting fellow at some point. So thank you all for being such amazing advisors and for taking the time to be with us today. I feel like we could have filled a 3-hour panel or maybe even longer with all of these questions. But yeah, thank you all for your attention. And we're going to have a bit of a break before I think our first student panel of the day is going to start at 11. So feel free to get up and stretch your legs. Thank you.
You're great. That was perfect.